Hi, everybody. This is Saad for the Saad Truth. Today, I have another fantastic guest. I should introduce him as Dr. Rob Henderson because he recently completed his PhD in psychology at Cambridge University. Rob, how are you doing?
I'm good, Gad. Good. It's great to be here. How are you?
Like, I'm doing great. I want to read. So, your book came out a few weeks ago. Let me just make sure I get the full title right. It's a memoir of your difficult, childhood growing up. Troubled, a memoir of foster care, family, and social class. And we'll get into all of that. Maybe you can give us just a, two, three, four, as long as you want, but a quick
Hmm.
synopsis of your journey, and then we'll drill down various points that we think might be worthy of exploring further.
Yeah, sure. The book covers my unusual and indirect path to higher education. You mentioned I received a PhD about a little over a year ago from Cambridge. Before that, I was at Yale, and but before entering these universities and receiving these degrees, my life was a lot different. I was born into poverty in Los Angeles, and my mother, and she became heavily addicted to drugs. I never knew who my father was, and my mom and I, for a time, we were homeless. We lived in a car. Eventually, we settled in this slum apartment in LA, and my mother was just not in a position to care for me, and I was put into the LA County foster care system when I was 3, and spent the next just shy of 5 years living in 7 different foster homes. And I detail those experiences in the book and how upsetting and destabilizing that was for me. I was adopted into this working class family just before my 8th birthday. And we settled in this kind of dusty blue collar town in Northern California called Red Bluff. And for a time, I had some stability there, but my parents separated shortly thereafter. And my adoptive father, who I had grown pretty close with over the course of about 18 months, he was extremely upset with my mother for leaving him. And as a way to retaliate at her, decided to cut off contact with me. And this was, I talk about it in the book how stressful and unexpected this was for me as a 9-year-old kid, and how, after never knowing my father, and then all of the foster homes, and then having a father, and then not having one, and so there's more to this story, more sort of separations and re unions with my mother fell in love with a woman, and then there was some financial catastrophe and family tragedies, and they later separated. And so by the time I was 17, I was very ready to flee and get out of there as soon as I could. So I enlisted in the US Air Force when I was 17. And from there, with some hiccups and some setbacks, I did manage to turn my life around and went to Yale on the GI Bill, and then off to Cambridge on scholarship. And so the book describes these experiences. I talk about how stunned I was when I arrived at Yale in 2015, and how unprepared I was, not just for the economic divides between the way I had grown up and the way that many of these students had been raised in terms of just material affluence and wealth, but also the stark differences in terms of family background, stability, personal experiences, socio-political opinions. I talk about this term I've popularized called luxury beliefs. I coined that term later in grad school, which has kind of entered the lexicon and taken on a life of its own. Um, but yeah, that's the short version. My mother came to the US as a young woman from Korea. So she came to the US from Seoul. And so I grew up knowing that part of my family background. I never knew who my father was. To this day, I have no idea. But I took a 23andMe genetic ancestry test last year and discovered that I'm half Hispanic on my father's side. And so now, Gad, what I tell people is that I went to bed white adjacent, and I woke up as an underrepresented minority. And I wish I had known that bit of information when I was applying for college and for graduate school, but I didn't. And so that's the story in a nutshell, but I'm happy to delve into any
Yeah,
part of that.
Well, but that's a perfect summary because I'm familiar with the general arc of your story, and I think you've summarized it well. So I guess the first question now, some of these questions I know the answer to them, but our listeners don't. So I'm asking it from
Hmm.
the perspective of trying to elucidate your story to our listeners, not necessarily to for myself, obviously. Uh, you've not ever spoken to your mother since last seeing her, and you've never met your biological father. Is there any ever in the dark recesses of your mind when you're in the privacy of your thoughts, are there any maybe fantasies is too strong a word, but any desire to ever meet them again? I understand they abandoned you. I understand that they obviously didn't care enough at the right times of your life to pay attention to you. But is there sort of a, for lack of a better term, I mean, the Christian thing of, kind of infinite forgiveness, and let's maybe we can
Hmm.
reunite now and make things right?
Um, well, I'm not a particularly religious person, and I think I admire the ideal of forgiveness. I don't think I have that in me. I have no desire to reconnect with people who would be willing to, you know, be that neglectful and not prioritize the needs of their kids. So yeah, I've never really had that strong desire to reconnect ever really. It's just not an impulse that I really understand. I think I've spoken with other adoptees before, and some of them have more sort of complex stories where they were close with their family for a time. But all of my memories, I talk about the earliest memories I have with my mother at 3 years old. It's essentially me being taken from her by police and then seeing her in handcuffs. And those are the earliest memories, the only memories of her I have. I have these kind of flashbulb memories of living in a car, but that's it. I have no fond memories with her, which may, to some extent, explain why I feel no warmth toward her, and certainly not to my father, who I've never met.
Okay, that might explain, I mean, and it's
Hmm.
perfectly reasonable and plausible for you to not want to, reconcile with them. But let's push it further. And obviously, we both studied psychology, so it's coming from that perspective. Uh,
Hmm.
is there let's suppose that you could find out about both your biological parents. Would it give you any sense of schadenfreude to know that their life is miserable and they suck? Or would you be, along the same lines, would you be terribly upset if you found out that your dad is now married? He's got 4 children. He's dad of the year 7 years in a row
Hmm.
in Portland, Oregon, and your mom has become this great woman with a wonderful family too. Would that, or they
Hmm.
always say that the worst thing for someone is when you're indifferent to someone, that's the ultimate sort of you don't care anymore. Or are you there, or do you still have that ire within you?
Um, yeah, I think I'm basically past it. Yeah, both of those scenarios, I don't think I would have a very strong response to it. And part of that, I think, Gad, is just because my life is pretty good now. If I was still, living in poverty or squalor, or in a less fortunate position in life, then maybe I would hang on more to those resentments and grudges, some of that Schadenfreude, or some of that anger, if their lives were, um, looking rosy. But I don't really feel anything either way for them. I was curious. Part of the reason why I took that genetic ancestry test last year was because, eventually, at age, how I was 33, to finally decide, okay, let's see what that side of my family looks like in terms of ethnicity. I was curious too about potential, now that I'm getting to the age where, I'm considering, eventually starting a family and having kids and those kinds of things. I was curious about genetic propensities, and did I have any um concerns there, or should I have, and there was nothing there, fortunately. Um and so, you know, I guess in a pragmatic sense, I would be curious. But otherwise, no, in terms of sort of personal connection, anything like that. There was a time, actually, I remember once my adoptive mother. So a lot of the information I have now and that I describe in the book came from a file my adoptive mother gave me when I left home after I became an adult. And contains documents and information from social workers and forensic psychologists and teachers and people involved in my case when I was in the foster system. And I learned that my grandfather, my mother's father, uh, was a former police detective who started a fertilizer company in Seoul and became relatively wealthy. And so, I remember I told some of my friends about this, and we were like, that would be cool, reunite with a rich grandpa, something like that. But
He's in
even
Korea.
now, yeah.
He's in
Well,
Korea.
I mean, he was as of, this was you know, uh, 20 plus years ago, 25 years ago. But now, I don't even know if he's still alive at this point. But, there was a time where I thought, that might be a cool experience.
Well, when you, I mean, I'm gonna come back to your adoptive parents in a second, but you kind
Mm,
of gave a segue to a question that I was planning on asking later about your future, likely, your family. You said, "Oh, I'm at an age where I'm starting to think about doing that." Do you think that and here it's, of course, it's speculative, only time will tell, but do you think that the experiences that you've gone through, the very difficult experiences you've gone through, are going to uniquely inform your parenting style and that you will be cognizant? I had really I mean, to put it mildly, neglectful parents, and I'm
mm.
going to orgiastically go to the other end of that continuum and maybe be overly doting or make sure that I don't make. Do you think about that? Do you worry that you may repeat some of those patterns, or what's your thought about your future trajectory as a parent?
Yeah. I don't think it would be very hard to do worse than my parents. But I guess it has made me think about things in a different way. Both my personal experiences and then my read of, the research in personality and intelligence and all of the psychological attributes, that there is that kind of standard line in behavioral genetics of parenting doesn't matter as much as we think. And I'm convinced, I'm persuaded of that in terms of those kind of measurable psychological traits that we tend to care about, personality and intelligence and so on, temperament and preferences. But I don't really care that much about those things. I care more about whether my child feels loved and supported, and regardless of whatever their IQ is going to be in 20 years, in the moment right now, how do they feel? Because that's what I spent a lot of time thinking about when I was a kid, and those feelings resurfaced as I was writing the book was, we know this kid that we're reading about in this book is going to, be a pretty successful person someday, but in the moment, he doesn't know that. I didn't know that that was what my life was going to be. All I knew was how I felt in the moment, the adults around me, feeling unnoticed or unwanted, and so on. And so, as long as my kid doesn't feel those things, that will be a priority for me, even more so than attaining the conventional badges of success that a lot of kind of upper middle class, upper class people tend to uh, be preoccupied with. I think I'll be a decent parent, equipped with all of this knowledge. But, I have noticed, so my girlfriend, she was raised by a very stable family. And that was important for me. Like, as long as one of the people in this pairing had a normal childhood,
Right.
that was very important to me, because if both of us came from kind of screwed up backgrounds, that would, dramatically, I think, increase the possibility that these kids might not have great upbringing. But, I'll defer to her judgment on a lot of this stuff.
Well, you raised, I listened to one of your chats. I can't remember. I think it was maybe the C-SPAN one,
Mm,
uh, where you raised, and obviously it shows that you've trained in psychology, because you differentiated between sort of two childhood stressors, one being, scarcity and harshness versus stability or lack thereof. And if I remember correctly, and I agree with it, it was much more the instability that had the negative downstream effects that you might expect. It wasn't so much. So if you're raised in a economically deprived environment, but you do have those stable parents that you're talking about, where there's that strong
mm,
sense of belongingness, love, nurturance, but yet we don't have that many calories on the dining room table. That's a lot
mhm.
better environment than I live in the right zip code, but I've got really shitty parents who don't give a damn about me. Did I summarize that properly?
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. Yes, that was, yeah, right. I mean, totally right. That, yeah, I've seen several papers on this. And yeah, it's pretty reliable. It's pretty I've seen some papers with a kind of tenuous link between childhood harshness and detrimental outcomes, but the correlation coefficients are always extremely low, often insignificant. But there is a pretty strong and reliable connection between instability and those detrimental outcomes, even when you control for childhood harshness or socioeconomic status. So, the kind of somewhat simplified punchline would be that growing up poor doesn't have the same effect as living in disorder or chaos. And yeah, even if you, because I have seen these studies where they've looked specifically at children in wealthy homes, wealthy meaning sort of one standard deviation above the mean, and these children have who are in highly unstable um home lives. They often later go on to have difficulties with addiction and substance abuse and self-harm behaviors and all kinds of things. And so I think it can be powerful enough. Sort of severe instability is, I think it's evolutionarily novel. Like poverty was the default for humanity for eons, but being raised in by 10 different people, nine of whom you'll never see again, that is kind of a novel environment.
Yeah.
And I think our brains aren't equipped to handle something like that, especially as a young child when the cement hasn't dried and you're still developing and so on. And so, that was something I struggled with this book, Gad, is like, when I hear stories like, frankly, like yours and the way that you grew up, people like Yeonmi Park, people who've had extreme, in war-torn countries or in totalitarian regimes. And then I'm writing about my kind of, these difficulties I experienced as a foster kid in LA in the 90s. I'm like, it was hard, but it wasn't like I was, running for my life.
Right.
But I think the difference is that, like, when people hear about surviving civil wars and political upheavals and totalitarian regimes, you go into it expecting that you're about to read something horrific.
Right.
Um, Whereas when you read about a kid in foster care, I don't think people expect it to be quite as dire as it actually is. There's that sort of mismatch between expectations versus the reality that I think actually does surprise a lot of people when they read about the foster care system, whether it's my story or other people who've lived through that kind of disorder.
I think the instability stressor. I mean, the way you're sort of parametrizing it is okay. I had to go to many different homes, and that results in a lot of obvious instability. I change schools. I have to get new friends. It's a new environment. It's a new dynamic in the family. But even within a singular, quote, stable family where it's the same family, the parenting style can introduce itself a form of instability or not. So, for example, if a child understands clearly the schedule of reinforcement, of punishments and rewards, if you do A, you'll get B, and that will be a recurring causal link. If you do X, there'll be Y. That
Mm.
environment is psychologically much healthier for a child than if I don't know when I'm gonna get the whack or the cigarette butt, because the fact that you might come home drunk and you've had a bad day, even though I tell you, hey daddy, I just got an A on my math exam, I might get slapped because I'm pissed. So that argument of instability applies at many layers. It applies at the grand layer that you're talking about, instability, that I don't know where I'm sleeping tonight. But it even applies within the stable unit of the parents that you always have. If their parenting style is not stable, that results in negative downstream effects.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, and those kinds of patterns are more pronounced, I think, in sort of low income families,
Yeah.
in single parent, unmarried parents. Simply because when there's one adult versus two, there's just that much more added stress and more sort of emotional swings and difficulties there. There were a couple of stories I left on the cutting room floor of my book I can tell you about that I ended up taking these out. But one was that my sister, when we were kids, she was an extremely picky eater. My younger sister, she was my adoptive parents' biological daughter. She
Right.
became my adoptive sister. And I remember shortly after my adoptive parents divorced, we would spend we'd spend 1 week with our mom and 1 week with her dad, and then eventually it was just me with the mom, and my sister would come and stay with us every other week. My mom would work all day, and then she would get home and she would be tired, but she would cook dinner, and my sister would she would complain and say I want chicken nuggets, I want pizza, I want corn dogs, and my mom had just prepared a very nutritious meal for us. But oftentimes my mom would relent because she was extremely burned out. She was stressed. She was struggling to keep the home financially afloat and had other commitments and obligations and, cooking dinner for two kids. But then later, when my mom entered a relationship with this woman named Shelley, my sister would
A
still battle
romantic
them.
relationship, right?
A
She came
romantic
out
relationship.
as gay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And they raised my sister and I for a time, and my sister would still battle them at the dinner table. But this time they wouldn't relent because there were two adults present and they could negotiate with her and tag team. And when you're stressed as an adult, having another adult present can keep your sanity when you have two whiny kids. It's just that much easier to have another adult who you can sort of lock eyes with and you both understand the situation you're
Right.
in and help retain the sanity versus when you're alone with two kids, the stress just increases dramatically. And I think this may be an overlooked force. I haven't looked at research on this about why there's an inverse correlation now for children, obesity and socioeconomic status, that poor kids in the US and in other Western countries now are more likely to be overweight. And I think part of that is just when you're a single parent and you are faced with a kid, it's just easier to give them some candy and some cookies and some junk food and let them chill out while you have a few minutes of peace. I think this is also perhaps why, um, there was a study I recently saw that children in homes that make less than $30,000 a year spend 2 hours more per day using screens than children from families that earn $100,000 or more per year. And again, I think part of this is, screens didn't exist when I was a kid the way they do now. But I think a lot of this is, you're a single parent and you're busy and you're frazzled. It's just easier to give your kid an iPad and put them in a corner and have some peace and quiet versus when you have two parents, you have more time to negotiate and find ways to occupy your child's time. And so I think like there are a lot of different kinds of patterns around families that are overlooked, and the benefits of two-parent families, which I talk about at length in the book.
Well, one of the in listening to your C-SPAN chat, I think you mentioned at one point that, despite the fact that you were a an average student at best, I think that might be a charitable uh, uh, position on how you would do. I think it was 2.2 your GPA. Does that sound right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
right.
so, but you said that, one of the things that kind of saved you is that you were actually someone who read a lot, who had a love for books. And I recently, I mean, this is something that I've mentioned endless number of times in all sorts of contexts about the importance of books. The research shows that if, one of the best predictors of your children's success is how many books your parents have. It's something that came
Mm,
up in my recent chat with Elon Musk, where he's a big lover of books, and that he came to North America with a suitcase of books. And
mm,
so do you ultimately think that, and the reason I'm asking this question is because to those young folks who might be, or even if they're not young, to the folks who are having a difficult time wrestling away their attention from Netflix and the latest
mm,
iPad, whatever. If you can't see around me here, I'm in my study. I'm surrounded. I'm basically a book hoarder. There are books in every little nook and cranny. And one of the things that stresses me the most in life is knowing how little I actually know, because I know how much there is out there and how many books there is yet for me to discover and read and consume. So, do you really feel that one of the lights at the end of the tunnel for you was precisely that you had this love for books, which then led you to the higher education that you ultimately had?
yeah, I think that definitely is a contributing factor. Once I learned to read, I mean, I taught myself to read. I was changing homes and changing schools so frequently that by the time I reached second grade, I still didn't know how to read. I barely knew the alphabet, but
Wow.
gradually had to learn and teach myself. And once it clicked for me, then I would visit the school library. I would read books. It was kind of a lifelong habit. It would wax and wane depending on kind of factors at home and what was going on around me, but I'd always retained that love of reading. And I do think that played some non-trivial role in my success. And, a lot of my attitude around school, like formal education, was, I didn't see the point of it. No one around me went to college. It wasn't really a common ambition. And, I had some of that impulsivity and some of that desire for thrill seeking and misadventure that I talk about in the book with my friends. And so I was still curious though. I even at age maybe 15 or 16, I would have scored high in Need for Cognition or something where I would read the textbooks, I would practice the math exercises, I would do those things. But when it came to, there was this rebellious streak too, where if the teachers wanted me to do homework or wanted me to present a science project to the class or something like that, I just would flat out refuse to do it. And so as a result, I barely passed my classes. And this is something else I think, a lot of people who, think that the education system will save us all, or, like it can do a little bit, but if a kid's home life is in shambles the way mine was, it doesn't matter how good the school is. My school was, it was a decent public school. The teachers did care. And I try to emphasize that in the book, that the teachers were good at identifying talented students. And they would urge me to apply myself, and they would ask me why I wasn't doing my work and my assignments and so on. But that the rebelliousness combined with lack of oversight at home just, led to that. But people will sometimes ask me, um, if the reason why I became successful was, if it was kind of those innate attributes that, was it more nature than nurture?
Mm.
And genetics and propensities and those that will always play some role in our outcomes. But one point I hoped to make clear in the book was that, being academically inclined is necessary but not sufficient to do well in school, where for me the raw ingredients were there, but the early life experiences I'd had, the lack of role models, not having a father at home, all of these kinds of things collectively led to me barely passing high school. And it wasn't until I spent years out of that environment in the military, in a rigid, structured environment that equipped me with good habits and mentors and role models and all those things, that finally at age 25, I finally thought, okay, maybe I could actually do this college thing. But I had to leave home and be in that structured environment for 8 years before those things finally clicked. And I was by far the most academically inclined of my friends. None of my friends at my high school read for pleasure. That would have been laughable to them to read books the way that I was.
Wow. Uh, so you mentioned, Yeonmi Park and myself and, your story. So I was asked, I'm trying to think, I think it was when I was at UT Austin a few years ago, I was giving a couple of talks. I actually tell that story in my latest book on happiness. A student, I think he was a student because he was a young guy, in the Q&A period said, I'm summarizing what he asked, said, you seem to have gone through, a very difficult childhood and so on. How is it that you can be successful and you always seem to be smiling and you love life and you're happy and so on? Which is one of the reasons why I actually wrote the happiness book. I had not intended,
Mm,
if you would have asked me when Parasitic Mind came out, what's my next book going to be about? I would be lying if I said, oh, my next book is going to be on happiness. It's because a lot of people would
mm,
ask me, what's your secret to happiness? And as this individual said, how is it that you've been able to turn some of the very, very difficult childhood stressors that you faced uh, into where you are now? And my answer, which I quote in full and the reason why I can quote it verbatim is because the talk and the Q&A were taped, so I can go back and
mm,
literally quote the exact answer verbatim. I basically said that the more difficulties I faced, not just from the Lebanese Civil War, which is about as horrifying as one can go through as a child, but I never have gone into this publicly, but I also didn't have the most nurturing family dynamics, some very difficult situations. But each time you messed with me, my feeling, maybe that's just my combative nature, it was, wait, I'm gonna shove all of this hurt up your ass one day. So there was
mm,
this kind of chip on my shoulder that it didn't matter how much you didn't pay attention to me, you didn't notice my straight A, report card, my soccer accolades, I was going to persevere irrespective of anything I faced. Do you feel that your childhood difficulties actually ended up serving a positive, which is because you face those stressors, it's the old. So I have a quote. Forgive my long-winded question, and I'll turn the floor to you in a second. In the happiness book, I have a quote in the epigraph on resilience and so on anti-fragility of failure and so on. I have a quote by Seneca, which I'm going to paraphrase here. He says that the strongest trees are those that have faced the greatest amount of wind stressor, because by definition,
Mm.
they evolve the capacity to be well rooted. They're not brittle. The trees that don't face a lot of wind stressors break very easily. So, in that sense, could it be that you are a strongly rooted tree precisely because of the difficulties that you went through?
Yeah, I think that's a useful way to think about it, especially when you're in the midst of disorder and struggle and stress, to um believe that it will make you stronger. And maybe, a moderate amount of it probably does. I'm more or less persuaded by Jonathan Haidt and others who've been talking, the anxious generation and this thing that Gen Z and helicopter parenting, this is not good for kids. But I certainly would never recommend the kind of upbringing that I had to become strong. I think sometimes I think that I succeeded despite rather than because
Right.
of my upbringing, because there were so many close calls and so many moments where things could have gone catastrophically wrong, and just through luck and happenstance that they didn't. Um, but all that being said, I do have that those early memories as a refuge. Whenever things get tough now, I can think, at least I'm not, washing dishes for minimum wage in Red Bluff, barely able to cover rent and all the bills that I had. At least I'm not, like there was even after I joined the military, I remember I advanced very quickly in rank, and I was able to move off base when I was 19, which was very young. Usually they like to keep the young guys on the military base to be monitored because they know that young guys have a tendency to get into trouble, misadventures. But I advanced very quickly, moved when I was 19, and whatever little money I had saved, I got a house with my military buddies, and I, learned for the first time renting a house, you have to pay the first month's rent, the last month's rent, and a security deposit. And I had this car that was having brake issues, and so I drained my bank account, and then I couldn't afford a belt. And so, I was embarrassed for a couple of weeks waiting for my next paycheck that I couldn't even afford a belt to keep my pants up. And now when things are tough, I'm like, well, at least I have, well, now I have two belts, but at least I have, enough money to take care of myself. And I can never really feel like or I never feel, what, it would just seem so self-indulgent to complain about anything now. And I think that's useful. But yeah, I guess to your question, yeah, I think a bit of stress is necessary to become strong, but I think at a certain point, at least in my life, it may have been too much
Well, that
for a
speaks.
young kid to handle.
Yeah, that speaks to another thing that I talk about in the happiness book, which is the old maxim that Aristotle taught us, which is everything in moderation, the golden mean, right? So
Mm,
what you're basically saying is you don't have enough stressors, that's not good. You won't be anti-fragile. You have too much stress, then maybe that, you'll kill yourself. But there is some moderate level of stress, which clearly you
mm,
exceeded, but there is some moderate level of stress that will probably be optimal for my future flourishing. And to your point
mm,
about you can contextualize anything that you're whining about today in contra what you went through as a child. I actually use that exact mechanism because whenever I'm
mm,
down, let's say, my latest book is out and I have to travel all over the place and I'm kind of I'm pissed because I've got to go here. I'm like, and then I'll stop and I say, are you really whining to yourself because a bunch of people are interested in talking to you about your book and giving you a forum? You got out miraculously out of the Middle East in a 1 in a million chance. Stop whining. And quickly I'm able to come out of it because it's easy
mm,
for us to whine about the immediate myopic thing that's pissing us off. But when you take a broader view, you do exactly what you did, which is I've got no reason to be whining. I really succeeded in light of what I went through.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you were to teleport back to your young self, enduring all of those difficulties and tell that young version, what your life is like now, and also the complaints that you have, like how would that young person respond? I don't, yeah, it feels self-indulgent. It
Exactly.
feels, yeah. So in that sense, I think there is a kind of a silver lining.
Right. If you don't mind me asking, what was the reason I'm going to ask this question is because I'm wondering if you did your PhD dissertation on a topic that relates to your childhood stressors. What
Hmm.
was your PhD dissertation on?
It was it was on moral psychology. So my a lot of it was building on the work of Jonathan Haidt and others on Disgust. I did some studies on COVID-19 as it relates to the moral foundations. Um, and I mean, unsurprisingly, found that people who were highly concerned, and these studies were ran in the middle of 2020, so the summer of 2020, when we were all locked down, and all we could do were online studies with Prolific and MTurk and so on. And so just finding that people who were highly concerned with COVID-19 also rated various moral transgressions more harshly, not just in terms of purity transgressions, but also authority and fairness and those things. And it was, largely mediated by discuss sensitivity and those kinds of things. So completely unrelated,
Okay,
unrelated
interesting.
to my, to my book or to luxury beliefs. Although I did one study, which I found a very strong correlation between social anxiety and moral condemnation. So people who scored very highly on social anxiety also were their moral judgments were particularly sharp with regard to very basic conventional transgressions around authority and fairness and purity and these kinds of things. And I found that to be kind of an interesting. I never did anything more with it, but I did find it interesting that people who are very morally judgmental tend to be more socially anxious. And it was a pretty high correlation coefficient as far as psychology goes. It was like 0.43 correlation coefficient.
Wow.
Um, but, otherwise, yeah, it was I just became very interested in psychology. I read The Righteous Mind when I was an undergrad, and then in grad school, once the university shut down for a time, research slowed. I started to write online more. I wrote some popular articles about luxury beliefs, started writing the book, and I saw I saw the direction of academia, and you're very familiar with a lot of the shortcomings of higher ed and the direction things are going. And so reconsidered my decision to go the academic path. I saw what happened with Erica Christakis at Yale. That was my very first semester on campus at Yale, was the
Oh,
Halloween costume
right.
controversy.
Yes.
And then one reason why I decided to do my PhD at Cambridge was because I thought that the UK would be less politically and ideologically captured than the US universities. And I had this image in my mind of like these very stern, like Oxbridge dons who just had no time for this kind of politically correct nonsense. But it turns out they do have time for it. And there have been many cases of cancellations and disinvitations. Jordan Peterson was supposed to be a guest research fellow at Cambridge
That's right.
my first year here in 2019. I was very excited for this. Um, and then he was disinvited, and there were kind of lower level, less sort of events that weren't as well covered in the media that also occurred while I was a student. And so yeah, I sort of transitioned away from that and into more sort of public writing and substacking and those kinds of things. But yeah, it's just been a strange experience where I get to Yale for undergrad. Suddenly, I see that happen with the Christakises. Then I get to Cambridge and Jordan Peterson, that happens, and so I'm like, maybe this isn't the right path for me.
Right. By the way, I remember the first time that you reached out to me.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think one of the
Hmm.
reasons I remember it is probably because you mentioned that you were an Air Force veteran. And one of the
Hmm.
things that I take great pride in is when I receive, you know, loving, supportive emails from fans and so on. where it is the corrections officer, where it is the truck driver, where it is the military guy, because it shouldn't be surprising, although most academics are invertebrate castrati, but assuming that there are a few who are rational and reasonable, well, it's not much of a feather off my cap that some guy from Stanford says, "Hey, I love your stuff. I'm a fan." That's okay, fine. But if the guy who is doing the 6 hour truck route
Mm,
in Kansas writes to me and says, you don't know how much your stuff has meant to me. I take great pride in that because I don't want to only be speaking to the guys in the ivory tower. I think that's why
mm.
I think my voice has resonated, within the larger crowd. And so I think I remember vividly, but although I think I had coded it that you were doing your PhD at Yale and not your
Ah,
undergrad. And the only reason I corrected that false memory in my brain is when I was preparing for this chat and I was looking
mm,
at your bio, I said, "Oh, okay, he got his PhD at Cambridge. I thought he got his PhD at Yale." So I
mm.
think it must have been that when you first contacted me, you were still doing your undergrad. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think so. I had heard you on Joe Rogan. I was,
Okay,
when I was still in the Air Force, I would my commutes, I would listen to Joe Rogan's podcast.
right.
And I think the first time I heard you must have been then. And then yeah, you've been on his show multiple times, and I
Yeah.
must have heard you again right around the time of all of the campus controversies throughout 2015 to 16 to 7. I mean, they're, endless, but at one point I heard you, very intellectually courageous and talking about your concerns with the universities. And yeah, I wrote you and said, it's just, I don't remember exactly what I said, but it was just so nice to hear a professor in the academy who was, unafraid to say what was really happening. And so many professors were afraid. I mean, I remember I spoke with one professor at Yale maybe a year after the Christakis controversy had blown over, and he was telling me how he tweeted something in support of them and how hurt he was to receive these emails and messages from undergrads who, how could you support a racist like Nicholas Christakis or Erica Christakis and so on and so forth. And he told me how hurt he was by this. And I don't know, in my mind, and maybe it is because of my upbringing and kind of what I consider to be hurtful or dangerous or unsafe versus what this professor thought. And maybe that's why, I would be curious if you think that's maybe why you're more courageous than a lot of your peers in the academy. So as he's telling me this, I thought like, you're a fully tenured professor at Yale and you care what a bunch of 19-year-old kids think about you. How could this possibly be hurtful to you? I mean, you run a world-class lab, you're doing all these great things, it just it didn't click for me that this would be something to be upset about. But what do you think? Do you think that your courage comes a bit from your experiences?
I mean, yeah, I mean, to your earlier point where you said, there's kind of an inextricable mix of nature and nurture for most phenomena that we might talk about. Certainly, my you know, unique life trajectory might have contributed to that. But I truly think that for this exact issue that you're asking, it really is the unique spots of the leopards that define my personhood, right? It's,
Mm,
as far back as I can remember, before I ever experienced the Lebanese Civil War, I'm someone who doesn't back down, and not because I'm frivolously combative or I'm contrarian by design. I'm just, I think I put it as I explained in the first chapter of the Parasitic Mind. I'm very, very much driven by a pathological sense of purity, right? And my mother famously told me once, when I was probably in my early 20s, Gad, you better learn quickly that the world doesn't abide to your purity bubble. And that's something that's
mm,
always come back to me because I've got this kind of stylized view of how the world ought to be. It should be pure. You should not tell lies. You should be dignified. You should have honor. And when I see all these castrated people not acting this way, it is really an attack on my
mm,
sense of well-being. Like, how could this person be such a coward? And I remember when I was 5, 6 years old, when we would go to the synagogue in Beirut, with my father, and I would ask my dad, okay, well, why are we now standing up during this prayer? Why are we sitting down? Why are we doing left? Why are we doing the Macarena to the right? And then his answer was, shut up, just do. And that had
mm,
struck, and maybe that was my original at least as far as I can remember, my original sort of disdain towards sort of organized rituals of religion. What do you mean, just do? Tell me why I'm doing it, right? And so
Mm,
to answer your question in a long-winded way, I think that yes, maybe my background has a bit to contribute to that, but I just think it's just part of my unique personhood. The unique random
mm,
combination of genes makes me that I can't not be who I am. Whereas
mm.
to your point, it amazes me that tenured professors who by definition are getting the institutional protection to give them liquid courage, right? You drink a beer so that you can get the courage to go up to the beautiful girl in the bar. Well, tenure is this big jug of beer that protects you. Nobody can touch you, and yet you're still whimpering in a fetal position. I'll give you a quick story, which you may have seen me comment on social media or not. I had a guy, his people, whatever, his publicist, his agent, whatever, reached out to me. He's a senior, of course, tenured Harvard professor of computer science. He is a winner of the Turing Award, which is, equivalent to having won the Nobel Prize. It's named after Alan Turing, the famous British mathematician. And his agent says, "Oh, Professor so and so would like to come on your show to discuss his upcoming book." I said, "Oh, that's fantastic. Great. I'm always open to having all kinds of conversations with all sorts of people." And so we go back and forth many times to finally set a schedule. And then the agent writes back to me and says, "I am so sorry to tell you this. I apologize for wasting your time, but Professor so and so has decided that you're too political and he doesn't want to get into." Now, I had already explained to the agent, because the guy, the professor, the author had said he doesn't want to talk anything political on the show. And I said, absolutely fine. We will only discuss. I have a computer science background and a math background. So we will completely geek it out. It will be a nerd talk. It'll be computer science stuff, analysis of algorithms, Turing machines. So I gave him that guarantee, but yet he felt too scared. I'm assuming here, I'm speculating, but that's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
That what if his cool friends at Harvard find out that they spoke to the real ogre Nazi Gatsad? No more invitations to the cool kids party. And to
Mm.
me, that is so undignified. It's so cowardly. So it speaks to exactly your point.
Yeah. I just, I remember I had this conversation with the professor asking why is it that professors with tenure won't speak their minds? And they gave me that exact answer, that basically because they want to have friends. Um, and you can't have friends as a tenured professor if you speak your mind and go against the orthodoxy, but they just won't be the friends at the fancy parties that you want to go to. You want to be accepted by a certain social group, and you don't want to be whatever, receive mean posts and emails on Twitter and so on. And it's just so cowardly. I mean, what's the point of having tenure? And I have friends who are going down that path. They are doing PhDs and postdocs and early career researchers, and they are attempting to do the thing where you keep your mouth shut and color within the lines, and then once you get tenure, speak out. But I do wonder if over time, if you spend years upon years doing that, if at some level that becomes who you are, and then when you do get tenure, um, you've become accustomed to keeping your mouth shut.
Well, and there's always the next expect, so now I am a tenured associate professor, but I don't want to risk my full professorship.
Yeah,
Well, now I got
right.
my full professorship. There's a chaired professorship. So there is always some can down the road that I need to modulate my true authenticity in order to, navigate through my careerist machinations. What an
Mm,
inauthentic, cowardly way to live. Now, but to the point of, are you going to be appreciated and admired by the right people?
mm,
Even if I were to use that calculus, I would argue that full authenticity is the best way to achieve that. And let me use my
mm,
personal experience. Had I modulated my speech in such a way that I'm only accepted by the people who drink their coffee this way and have a progressive lisp in academia, then probably Elon Musk would not have become a friend, right? Elon Musk loves exactly the things that God Saad is, right? So if I had come into a priori with the goal of impressing the right people, who better person to impress than Elon Musk? But I didn't come into it with this approach, right? I said,
Mm,
I'm going to present myself to the world as God Saad. The people who like it, great. The people who don't can go F themselves. And then guess what? The right people show up. I'll give you another
mm,
example. I received an email. So you may or may not know that my biggest hero, whom I'm willing to leave my wife for, is Lionel Messi, right?
mm,
So, I used to be a serious soccer player. I love Lionel Messi, not only for his intergalactic talent, but also the way he carries himself. What a man of humility, a family guy, never a scandal, just a perfect role model. Well, one day I'm opening my messages and I have an email from, so dear Professor Saad, my name is so and so. I am the majority owner of Inter Miami FC. I know of your love of Lionel Messi. Anytime that you'd like to come to a game and meet him and hang out, you're my guest. Well, from my perspective, to my earlier point about being able to reach the corrections officer, the military guy, and the truck driver, being able to have a corpus of material that allows me to have Elon Musk appreciate me and the owner of Inter Miami is a lot better than having some smarmy idiot with a progressive list saying, "Oh, we love that you love Biden more than you know." So even
mm.
on that metric, I think I've won what they're trying to win.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the key if you want to become friends with those who you would actually get along with and who you don't have to edit yourself around, uh, then be yourself. I remember my first year I arrived at Cambridge. Being a PhD student is already somewhat isolating. It's not like undergrad where you're, with classes and social events and so on. It's a little bit different, especially in the UK. It's very self-driven, and so it was difficult to find social groups and everything, and also because of the prevailing dogma at a university. But shortly after Jordan was disinvited from campus, I wrote an op-ed challenging the university's decision to do this. And somehow the New York Times actually ran it. This was 2019, before 2020, when they became fully what
Yeah.
they are now. The New York Times pre 2020 was still, they would run different kinds of op-eds, and so they ran this, and then within 24 hours, I started to receive emails from other students, from faculty, from people all around the university who agreed with me and who, wanted to meet. And, and as a result of that, I made a lot of friends and became plugged in to a lot of different social networks on campus, kind of underground dissenters and people who, and without that, who knows? My experience would have been a lot different, in terms of the connections I made, the friendships that I formed, the people that I met. And so I think there's a lot of value to be gained from just being yourself and seeing what happens. Even if a lot of people don't like you for it, I think a lot of people, you'd be surprised at the number of people who quietly agree with you and who, you know, will reach out as a result. Yeah.
Right. So what's your so you mentioned earlier that you've made the willful decision that, academia is not for me. Okay, fair enough, which of course is so regrettable in that I know of a million such cases where people write to me, right? They say, "Oh, I just completed two postdocs. Here's my CV, professor, but I'm out of this dump." And my heart aches because you're losing that brain capital, right? That person in the right environment, in the right ecosystem, could have done great thing. And they said, and I understand them. They said, I'm out. This sucks." So okay, academia is out. So where do you see your professional trajectory heading? Do you
Hmm.
have a sense, or is it very much serendipitous, ad hoc? Let's see what the next possible move might be.
Um, it's more so ad hoc. I'm doing things that I enjoy, and so Substack has been just a terrific platform for me. I started writing a newsletter when I was still in grad school, and then Substack approached me to move to their platform, and that was back when they were still doing Substack Pro deals. So they gave me a very generous advance, and so I've remained on their platform. I write 2 or 3 posts a week, and that's been paying the bills. And I did a lecture series for Peterson Academy,
Yes.
um, and I wish great things for all kind of experiments right now in higher education. I think there can be reform from within, but I think that will be a kind of decades long or potentially generations long battle to recapture the legacy institutions. So, in the meantime, I think, yeah, if people want to launch new educational ventures, I'm all for it. And yeah, I mean, with the book, it's doing well. I have been, I've had informal conversations with Hollywood producers about the possibility of optioning
Wow.
it. Yeah, but these have just been informal kind of conversations. So there is some interest there. I haven't signed anything yet, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I think a lot of people are connecting with the story. One thing that I didn't expect actually with this book, I had this concern when I was writing it that people wouldn't actually follow it or connect with it because it's such a unusual experience. Most people don't know anyone in foster care; they have no contact with it, and I wondered if people would just find this so foreign to their own experience, but I've been surprised at the number of readers who've contacted me and said that, despite that, they've had maybe more sort of conventional upbringings, but there may have been issues with addiction in their family or divorce or abuse or neglect or all of those kinds of things that a lot of people in their families have suffered and endured, and people are connected. Upward mobility is another big theme of the book as well, of coming from this kind of working class background into higher ed and kind of the observations and lessons I learned along the way. People connect with that, and so it seems like the book has a wider, more universal readership than I anticipated. And so, that's been gratifying to see. So, but otherwise, I'm keeping options open and seeing what comes at me, and it's been rewarding so far.
Who would be the dream actor to play Rob Henderson?
Someone more handsome than me.
I always tell
Yeah.
people that it would be very difficult to turn my story into a film because
Mm.
who could you have that could be as handsome as the original God Saad? So that's the obstacle I face.
I
Uh,
see.
but see, by the way, this kind of humor, when I make it, I will get I mean, many people will laugh and get the joke. Other people will say, "You're so arrogant and narcissistic." One of the things that shocks me the most about my interactions on social media is the extent to which there is an epidemic of humorless people. It's just
Mm.
mind blowing, right? Because as someone who is very jocular, and I can be very self-deprecating, I can joke about other people, I can make fun of anything. I could just having fun, life as a playground. I'm amazed at the amount of time, for example, that people miss my sarcasm. So I had one guy recently, a Jewish guy, I won't mention his
Mm.
name, but it's a very, very Jewish name, write me this scathing email because I often use sarcasm and satire when I'm making a position. And so I wrote a tweet where it would clearly seem that I'm, anti-Jewish, Hamas, I'm pro Hamas, and it's the Jews that did and so on. I'm Jewish, right? I'm very anti-Hamas. So he writes me this scathing thing where, I mean, really, really brutally nasty. And so I just kind of write back, you are a genuinely abject schmuck. Do a bit more research, and maybe you could find that, blah, blah, blah. So then he writes me, to his credit, a very, very sort of civil apology. And I say, it's all forgotten, it's all good. But it gives you a sense of the amount of bile and anger and humorless that happens. Is this something that, I mean, I know
Mm.
you don't use humor as often as I do, but is this something that you've also picked up in your social media engagement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that inevitably, as your following grows, you're going to attract, people who are a bit unhinged. There was a great post, I think it was from Tim Ferriss a few years ago about something like, what happens when you become famous. And, I'm not as famous as Tim Ferriss, but he had this line in there about something like, if you assume 1 in 1,000 people is crazy, and you have 100,000 followers, then that means 100 crazy people follow you.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's like mathematically it helps to contextualize. And so I do get unhinged emails on occasion, or people who say, that I'm classist somehow, or that I'm downplaying the importance or the role of that poverty plays in people's life, and all these other things. Of course I don't do these things. I don't know if I'm classist, but I'm willing to make value judgments that not committing crimes is better than committing crimes, and people will call me classist for something like that. Um, so of course, yeah, Zuby, he writes about how, once you reach a certain number of followers, you just have to become more active in terms of muting and blocking
Yeah.
and just, and I wasn't expecting that. I think probably right around the time I crossed maybe 20 or 30,000 followers, it was just this dramatic increase in trolls and people who would willingly and willfully, sort of uncharitably interpreting everything you post, and that can be very obnoxious. But yeah, yeah, I admire your humorous tweets. I think we need more of it. And it's nice to, you get all these people posting negative stuff and posting their hot takes, and then I see one of your tweets and I'm like, it's nice to laugh.
Well, it's funny because I joke with my wife. I say, I'm going to start getting offended because whenever I would say 70% of the time, Rob, when a fan comes up to me on the street, it won't be about something professorial that I've done. Oh, I loved your, stuff on evolutionary psychology or this. It'll always be about how much some humorous shtick I'm doing resonates with them, right? That they love this, they're cracking up laughing. But in a sense, it points to the fact of how humor is so disarming, right? One of the
Mm,
things that I've often been asked is, why don't you get even more hate than you get? Because I really do. I never hold back anything. I don't modulate a millimeter of speech, and yet you would think that I should get a hell of a lot more hate. And I think part of that is
mm,
the personal style with which you deliver your message, which is even your detractors, once they get to know you and see, a warmth, a playfulness, it makes it a bit harder for people to hate you if you have a warm style in your
mm,
communication. Well, what do you think?
mm. I think that's right. And yeah, having a warm style and also not having an overtly cantankerous disposition too. I think that also helps. I know others who have large followings who seem to attract a disproportionate share of haters and trolls and detractors. And I think many of them bring it on themselves because they will frame their thoughts in the most barbed and vicious and aggressive way
Right.
possible. Versus if you take the same observation and package it in the form of like you might as a joke, or as trying to see the humor in a real life phenomenon, or referencing a study, or just being sort of more neutral or impartial about your observation. Um, there are different ways to frame the same post,
Right.
and you'll get very different kinds of people who follow you and who will ridicule you for it.
Well, last question. Are there any projects that you're currently working on that are not yet out, that a next book, a next
Mm.
project, a new media, whatever it is that you'd like to use this opportunity to promote? Take it away.
Uh, nothing, nothing in the sort of medium to long term, but short term. I'm still promoting the book, of course, Troubled, and my Substack, robkhenderson.com, where I write, yeah, 2 to 3 posts a week. And yeah, it seems to be growing in popularity and interest, especially since the book's been out.
Wonderful. Well, listen, continued success with the book, Rob. I'm so glad that we finally met, quote, in person. I look forward to following your growing career. Come back anytime you'd like. Stay on the line so we could say goodbye offline. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Gad. It's been great.
Cheers. Cheers.